They didn't fire Emily Carter because she was useless. They fired her because they thought she was replaceable. But at exactly 9:17 a.m., when the first truck stalled, the ports went silent, and millions of dollars began bleeding by the minute, they realized the truth. Emily wasn't just part of the system. She was the system. And now, the woman they discarded was the only one who could decide whether their empire survived or burned. At exactly 6:42 a.m., before most of Chicago had finished its first cup of coffee, Emily Carter was already holding the country together. Emily Carter, 42, stood at 5'7" with a lean, practical build shaped more by stress than exercise. Her chestnut brown hair was always tied in a low, no-nonsense bun, and faint lines framed her sharp green eyes, earned from decades of solving problems no one else even saw coming. She dressed simply: neutral blouses, dark slacks, sensible shoes. Nothing about her appearance demanded attention, but everything about her presence commanded control. Emily wasn't loud. She didn't need to be. People listened because when she spoke, things moved. She had learned that the hard way, back in her 20s, when a misrouted shipment during a Midwest blizzard cost a small company millions. She had been junior staff then, ignored. After that, she made sure she would never be ignored again. Her desk sat in the operational core of Atlas Freight's Chicago headquarters, not a corner office, but the nerve center. Screens flickered with live tracking maps, shipment logs, and port updates. To an outsider, it looked like chaos. To Emily, it was a symphony. "Morning, boss," came a gravelly voice through her headset. That was Mike Dawson. Mike Dawson, 58, was a veteran truck driver with a weathered face, sunburnt skin, and a thick grey beard that made him look older than he was. He was broad-shouldered, with the slow, deliberate movements of someone who had spent decades behind the wheel. Mike was loyal, stubborn, and fiercely protective of his roots. Years ago, a failed partnership had nearly bankrupted him, leaving him distrustful of corporate management. But he trusted Emily. "Morning, Mike," Emily replied calmly, eyes scanning 3 screens at once. "You're flagged for reroute out of St. Louis. Who approved that?" "Some new system update," Mike grumbled. "Says I'm inefficient." Emily's jaw tightened slightly. "You're not inefficient. The system is." Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard. Within seconds, she overrode the automated route. "You're back on your original line. I'll deal with the rest," she said. A pause. Then Mike exhaled. "Knew you would. You always do." Because Emily knew something the system didn't. Mike's route wasn't just about distance. It avoided a notoriously unreliable way station that could delay shipments for hours. Algorithms didn't understand trust. Emily did. As she logged the override, a shadow fell across her desk. "Emily?" said a softer voice. Sarah Nguyen stood there, holding a tablet. Sarah, 34, was sharp-featured with shoulder-length black hair and alert brown eyes that missed very little. She dressed more modern than Emily, tailored blazers, clean lines, but carried the same quiet intensity. Efficient, observant, and fiercely loyal, Sarah had built her career under Emily's mentorship. But unlike Emily, she still believed things could change. "You heard?" Sarah asked. Emily didn't look up. "He starts today." Sarah hesitated. "Ryan Blake, new CEO, Harvard MBA, big on transformation." Emily finally leaned back slightly, expression unreadable. "They always are." Sarah lowered her voice. "I heard he's bringing in his own people, new systems, new structure." Emily gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. Let him try. But Sarah didn't smile back. He's already reviewing departments. And Emily... She paused, choosing her words carefully. He doesn't like legacy operations. That made Emily stop, just for a second. Then her hands resumed moving across the keyboard. Good, Emily said quietly, because legacy operations are the only reason this place still works. Behind them, the screens continued to flicker. Trucks moved, routes adjusted. Millions of dollars in goods flowed through invisible lines of trust and timing. And at the center of it all, unnoticed by most, was Emily Carter, keeping everything alive. For now. Ryan Blake arrived at 9:03 a.m., 21 minutes later than the time listed on his own company-wide announcement email. The delay wasn't accidental. It was theatrical. Ryan Blake, 32, looked like he had stepped out of a business magazine cover. Tall at 6'1", lean but carefully maintained, with perfectly styled blonde hair and a jawline sharp enough to look engineered. He wore a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than most employees' monthly rent. His smile was polished, his handshake firm, and his confidence excessive. Ryan was the kind of man who had never truly failed, at least not in a way that stuck. Born into wealth, educated at elite institutions, and fast-tracked into leadership, he believed systems could solve everything. People, to him, were variables, replaceable ones. Emily watched him from across the operations floor without standing up. She didn't need to meet him to understand him. She had seen his type before, just never this young, and never with this much authority. "Good morning, team." Ryan's voice carried across the room, energetic, rehearsed. A small group followed him, his new innovation team. Leading them was Daniel Brooks, 29, slim, slightly hunched, with round glasses and a constant nervous smile. He dressed casually compared to Ryan, button-down shirts with rolled sleeves, sneakers instead of dress shoes. Daniel was brilliant with data, but uncomfortable with confrontation. He trusted numbers more than people, mostly because numbers had never lied to him the way people had during a failed startup he once co-founded. Behind him was Chloe Mercer, 27, sharp-featured, impeccably dressed, with platinum blonde hair and a gaze that evaluated everything like a brand asset. She spoke little, but when she did, it was with calculated precision. Chloe specialized in corporate culture transformation, a phrase Emily already disliked. Ryan clapped his hands once. "We're entering a new era. Atlas Freight is going fully digital. Automated routing, predictive logistics, AI-driven vendor selection. Efficiency is the future." Emily kept typing. Sarah stood beside her, arms crossed. "This should be interesting," she muttered. Ryan continued, pacing like a TED Talk speaker. "We're eliminating outdated processes. No more manual overrides. No more dependency on individuals. The system will handle everything." That made Emily pause, just briefly. No more dependency on individuals. Her eyes flicked to Mike's route, still displayed on her screen. "Excuse me," Sarah suddenly spoke up, stepping forward. Her voice was calm, but firm. "What happens when the system makes the wrong call? For example, rerouting drivers into delays or unsafe conditions?" Ryan turned, smiling like he'd been waiting for that question. "The system doesn't make mistakes. It learns." Emily finally looked up. "All systems make mistakes," she said quietly. The room shifted. Ryan studied her for the first time. "And you are?" "Emily Carter, Operations." There was a flicker of recognition. Her name carried weight, even here. but Ryan masked it quickly. "Well, Emily," he said smoothly, "that's exactly the mindset we're moving away from. Trust the data." Emily held his gaze. Data doesn't drive trucks through snowstorms. A brief silence. Chloe stepped in, voice cool. "That's why we're optimizing risk models." Sarah exhaled sharply. "Models don't build trust with drivers." Ryan's smile tightened slightly. "We appreciate the feedback, but we need alignment, not resistance." That word, alignment, hung in the air like a warning. By noon, the changes had already begun. Emily's system access showed new restrictions. Manual overrides required approval. Vendor communications were rerouted through Daniel's team, and Sarah— "Hey," she said quietly, returning to Emily's desk an hour later, holding a printed notice. "I've been reassigned." Emily looked up. "Where?" "Internal strategy, under Chloe." Sarah forced a small smile. "Guess I'm part of the future now." Emily studied her. "You spoke up." "Yeah," Sarah said. "Apparently that's not efficient." Across the floor, Ryan stood with his team, pointing at dashboards, already reshaping a system he didn't understand. Emily turned back to her screen. For the first time in years, she wasn't sure if she was watching progress or the beginning of a collapse. By mid-October, the air inside Atlas Freight had changed. It wasn't loud chaos. Emily would have preferred that. Noise meant problems you could see. This was quieter, heavier, like pressure building beneath the surface. Peak season had arrived. Retail shipments surged, warehouses filled beyond capacity, and every route, every second mattered. And for the first time in 20 years, Emily Carter didn't have full control. Emily, still composed on the outside, felt the shift in ways others couldn't. Her posture remained straight, her voice steady, but her eyes moved faster now, constantly scanning, recalculating. She had survived crises before, storms, strikes, system failures. But this was self-inflicted, and that made it dangerous. "Emily?" A voice crackled through her headset. Mike Dawson again, but this time there was something different, less certainty. "They're holding my payment," he said. "Says it's under automated review. Been driving 3 days straight and now I gotta wait?" Emily's fingers paused mid-keystroke. That wasn't just an error. That was a fracture. "I'll check," she said, already pulling up the vendor system. The interface looked cleaner now, Daniel's redesign. Sleeker, more efficient, and far less transparent. "Payment flagged due to route deviation," she read quietly. Mike scoffed. "You told me to take that detour, saved 6 hours." "I know," Emily replied, but the system didn't. Across the floor, Daniel Brooks sat hunched over his laptop, typing rapidly. His fingers moved with nervous precision, eyes locked onto streams of data. He looked up briefly when Emily approached, adjusting his glasses. "There's an issue with driver payments," Emily said. "Your system is flagging valid routes." Daniel hesitated. "It's not my system, it's the model. If a route deviates from predicted efficiency, it triggers a review. Even if the deviation improves delivery time?" Daniel blinked. "The model doesn't account for subjective decisions." Emily's expression didn't change, but her tone sharpened slightly. "Experience isn't subjective." Before Daniel could respond, another voice cut in. "Problem?" Ryan Blake stepped into the conversation, hands casually in his pockets, posture relaxed but eyes alert. He had learned quickly where tension gathered, and he seemed to enjoy stepping into it. "Drivers aren't getting paid," Emily said directly. Ryan tilted his head. "Temporarily delayed. The system ensures accountability." They won't wait, Emily replied. Drivers don't run on delayed payments. Ryan smiled faintly. Then they'll adapt. That was the moment something shifted. Not loudly, not visibly, but permanently. At 11:20 a.m., Sarah, now seated across the building in the strategy department, watched a dashboard update in real time. Even from her new position, she could see the anomalies. Delayed shipments, payment flags, rising exception reports. Chloe, she said, turning to her new supervisor. Chloe Mercer barely looked up from her tablet. Yes? These numbers, drivers are starting to slow down. If payments stall, they'll stop entirely. Chloe's tone remained calm. Temporary inefficiency during transition. It's not temporary if they lose trust, Sarah pressed. Chloe finally looked at her, expression cool. Trust is scalable, Sarah. We're rebuilding it. Sarah stared at the screen. She knew better. Trust didn't scale. It fractured. At 2:05 p.m., another alert hit Emily's screen. Client escalation. Priority. Critical. The name made her sit up straighter. Harrison Retail Group. A $200 million account. The call came through immediately. Emily, said a sharp, controlled voice. This was Richard Hale, 50, CEO of Harrison Retail, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, with the clipped tone of a man who valued time above everything. He wasn't rude, he was precise. And when he called personally, it meant something was wrong. We have 3 shipments delayed, he said, and your team is giving me automated responses. Emily closed her eyes for half a second. I'm aware. I'm working on it. You have until tomorrow, Hale said, or we move the contract. The line went dead. Emily sat there, staring at the screen. Around her, the system still looked functional. Trucks were moving, data was flowing, reports were clean. But underneath, drivers were hesitating, clients were doubting, and the cracks were spreading. The email arrived at 7:18 a.m., before Emily Carter had even finished reviewing overnight exception reports. No warning. Employment status update. Emily sat still for a long moment in her quiet apartment overlooking downtown Chicago. At 42, she lived alone in a modest space, clean, organized, functional, much like her life. A few framed certificates lined the wall, but no personal clutter. Her face showed little reaction, yet her fingers rested motionless on the edge of her laptop. She had seen corporate decisions before. What made this different was not the decision itself, but the timing. Too precise, too clean. When she arrived at Atlas Freight headquarters at 8:05 a.m., security already knew. At the entrance stood Greg Holloway, 45, head of corporate security. Broad-shouldered, shaved head, wearing a black suit that made him look more like enforcement than protection. Greg was once military police, a man who had learned to follow orders first and question later. His loyalty wasn't personal, it was procedural. Emily Carter? He asked unnecessarily. Yes, she replied calmly. I need your badge. No hesitation. She removed it and placed it in his hand. The metal felt lighter than it should have. Inside, the office continued operating as if nothing had changed. Screens still glowed, trucks still moved, systems still processed. But people avoided looking at her directly, as if acknowledgement might make it real. At the center of it all stood Ryan Blake. Ryan, still sharply dressed in his navy suit, looked almost pleased. Not emotional, satisfied, like a problem had resolved itself neatly. Emily, he said when she approached, we're restructuring. This is not personal. Emily studied him. It usually is. Beside Ryan stood Chloe Mercer, expression unreadable, and Daniel Brooks, shifting uncomfortably, eyes avoiding Emily's gaze entirely. It's about alignment, Ryan continued. You've been resistant to cultural integration. I kept the system running, Emily said. You kept your version of the system running, Chloe corrected softly. That silence after her words was sharp. Ryan nodded once. We need adaptability, not dependency on individuals. Emily almost smiled. Then you should be fine without me. No one responded. By 9 a.m., her access was gone. Completely. No partial permissions, no legacy override. Just silence. Sarah Nguyen noticed first. From the strategy floor, she watched as system alerts began to spike again, this time more erratic. Payment queues stalled. Route exceptions multiplied. The structure was holding, but barely. Sarah, usually composed, stood abruptly from her desk. Her sharp eyes scanned data streams with growing urgency. She was younger than Emily by 8 years, but had learned much of logistics under her mentorship. Her loyalty had always been quiet, but absolute. Without permission, she opened a secure channel and began extracting archived operational logs. Sarah? Chloe's voice came from behind her, cold, controlled. I'm backing up historical routing data, Sarah said quickly. That's not your responsibility anymore. It is if the system collapses, Sarah replied. Chloe stepped closer, gaze narrowing. Be careful. Sarah didn't respond, but she continued anyway. At 10:42 a.m., Mike Dawson called. Emily was sitting outside a small cafe near the river when her personal phone rang. She hesitated before answering. Emily? Mike's voice was strained. No humour, no ease, just tension. What's wrong? She asked. It's everything, Mike said. Routes are changing mid-drive, payments still frozen. Half the guys are talking about parking trucks until this gets fixed. Emily closed her eyes briefly. She had predicted this, but prediction and prevention were not the same. They fired you, didn't they? Mike added quietly. Yes, she said simply. A pause. Then Mike exhaled heavily. Then we're on our own. I'm still here, Emily said. That's what I was afraid of, he muttered. Not anger, but concern. Back at headquarters, Ryan reviewed performance dashboards with Daniel and Chloe. System stability is 92%, Daniel reported nervously. He was pale now, fingers tapping faster than usual. But anomaly frequency is increasing. Ryan leaned back. Within acceptable thresholds. Chloe glanced at him. For now, Daniel hesitated. We may need legacy override protocols reinstated. Ryan's expression tightened slightly. We are not reverting. That word, reverting, hung in the air like a line drawn in stone. At 1:15 p.m., Emily received a final message from Sarah. No text, just a data file, encrypted. Inside were internal system logs, routing overrides, payment triggers, and decision trees. And one line that mattered more than the rest. All operational dependencies still trace back to Emily Carter's legacy architecture layer. Emily stared at the screen. They hadn't removed her from the system. They had only removed her from the room. And the system didn't know the difference yet. 48 hours after Emily Carter's termination, Atlas Freight no longer felt like a company. It felt like a machine slowly forgetting how to breathe. From a distance, everything still looked operational. Dashboards glowed, trucks appeared active on maps, and automated notifications continued to generate reports. But inside the system, something fundamental had broken. Decisions were being made, but not understood. Actions were being triggered, but not verified. Emily, sitting in a quiet, rented workspace near the river, observed the chaos through the encrypted dataset Sarah had sent. Her posture remained steady, but her eyes narrowed slightly with each new anomaly. She was 42, composed as ever, hair still tied back, face unreadable, but beneath that calm was a mind already mapping failure paths. "They didn't replace me," she muttered. "They disconnected me." And the system had begun to starve. On Interstate 55, Mike Dawson sat in his truck for the third hour without movement. His weathered hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles pale. Mike, 58, had the build of a man shaped by decades of hauling freight across American highways, broad shoulders, sun-beaten skin, and tired eyes that had seen too many winters on the road. Normally calm, even patient, today he was restless. "Dispatch isn't answering," he said into his phone. "Fuel card got declined at the last stop. I'm sitting in the middle of nowhere with a refrigerated load that's starting to worry me." Around him, other trucks were also frozen, some idling, some completely shut off. Drivers leaned out of windows, shouting updates that no one could resolve. "We're blind out here," another driver yelled down the line. Mike exhaled sharply. "Feels like the whole damn system just forgot us." Back at Atlas Freight headquarters, chaos was no longer subtle. It was visible. Daniel Brooks sat at his workstation, sweat forming at his temples. His fingers flew across his keyboard, but the more he adjusted parameters, the worse the system behaved. Daniel, usually neat and precise in appearance, now looked disheveled, shirt wrinkled, glasses slightly askew, hair uncombed. For the first time in his career, his logic wasn't producing clarity. It was producing contradictions. "This shouldn't be happening," he muttered. "The model is stable." "It is not stable," Chloe Mercer replied coldly. Chloe stood behind him, arms crossed. Her perfectly tailored blazer and composed expression contrasted sharply with the growing tension around her. But even she could not fully hide the strain in her eyes now. "We've got stalled routes in 5 states," Daniel said. "Payment loops are failing. Driver authentication is degrading." Chloe stepped closer. "Fix it." "I can't." Daniel stopped himself. "It's not responding like it used to." That sentence lingered. Not responding like it used to. Because the system wasn't just malfunctioning, it was losing its reference point. In a roadside diner outside St. Louis, Sarah Wen watched the crisis unfold on a borrowed terminal. The fluorescent lights flickered above her, reflecting off her tense expression. Sarah, 34, normally calm and analytical, now had a sharpness in her posture that bordered on urgency. Her black hair was tied back messily, and her eyes moved rapidly across every update. She had left the office temporarily hours ago, but in reality, she was now outside the structure entirely, watching it collapse from a safer distance. "They're losing synchronization," she whispered. The diner owner, a middle-aged man named Carl Jennings, stocky, balding, with a permanent coffee stain on his apron, looked over curiously. "Everything all right there, miss?" Sarah hesitated. "No," she admitted quietly. "Not even close." By evening, the breakdown had become undeniable. Customer contracts began auto-pausing. Vendor agreements defaulted to manual review. Entire shipping lanes stalled due to missing authorization chains. At the center of it all, Ryan Blake stood in the executive boardroom, staring at the live system feed. Ryan, once confident and polished, now looked slightly less composed. His suit remained perfect, but his expression had tightened. For the first time since taking over, uncertainty crept into his posture. "This is temporary," he insisted, but no one responded. Daniel didn't look up. Chloe didn't speak. Even the room itself seemed quieter. Because outside the glass walls, Atlas Freight was no longer moving as one organism. It was fragmenting into disconnected parts, each following rules that no longer aligned. And somewhere outside the company entirely, Emily Carter was still watching. Not interfering, just observing the collapse of something that had once depended entirely on her to exist. The collapse of Atlas Freight did not end in noise. It ended in silence. Systems freezing, trucks stopping, contracts dissolving into unreadable error logs. And in that silence, Emily Carter began building something else. She worked from a modest converted loft above an old print warehouse in downtown Chicago. The space was bare, except for 3 monitors, a whiteboard filled with routing logic, and stacks of handwritten notes, old habits she never fully abandoned. Emily, now 42, carried the same disciplined presence as before. Tall, lean, hair tied back tightly, sharp eyes that missed nothing. But there was something different in her expression now. Less obligation, more intent. Across from her sat Victor Hale, CEO of Nova Logistics. Victor was in his early 50s, broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair and a calm, almost surgical way of speaking. He wore no tie, just an open collar shirt and a worn leather jacket, as if he preferred function over presentation. Unlike most executives, he did not interrupt. He observed. "You weren't wrong," Victor said quietly, reviewing the failure report from Atlas Freight. "You were just inside a system that couldn't evolve." Emily didn't look away from the screen. Systems don't fail randomly. They fail when they lose continuity. "That continuity was you?" Victor asked. She paused. "Partly." That was enough for him. Meanwhile, Mike Dawson had not moved in 11 hours. His truck sat near a rest stop in Illinois, surrounded by dozens of immobilized vehicles. Some drivers had given up and gone inside diners. Others stayed, watching their dashboards like patients waiting for vital signs. Mike, rugged and tired, leaned against his cab when a black SUV pulled up beside him. A woman stepped out. Sarah Nguyen. She looked different outside corporate walls, less polished, more real. Her hair was tied back simply, and she wore a plain jacket over jeans. But her eyes still carried the precision of someone who once lived inside systems. "Mike Dawson?" she asked. Mike narrowed his eyes. "Depends who's asking." "I used to work for Atlas." That alone made him. "Then you're either here to apologize or fix something. Which is it?" "Neither," Sarah said. "I'm here to offer you a way out." At the same time, Emily and Victor were finalizing the foundation of a new platform, Nova Core. Unlike Atlas, it was not built around rigid control points. It was designed around distributed trust nodes, self-correcting routes that did not depend on a single operator. "This will never freeze like Atlas did," Victor said. Emily finally turned to him. "It won't freeze because it won't rely on one brain." Victor smirked slightly. "That sounds like a compliment." "It's not," she replied. "It's a warning." Still, she agreed to proceed. By the next morning, Sarah had brought Mike to a small logistics hub on the outskirts of St. Louis, one of Nova's temporary field stations. The place was functional but not corporate. Folding tables, laptops, coffee machines running non-stop. Mike stood awkwardly in the center. "So, what is this? A startup warehouse?" Sarah shook her head. "It's a restart point." Behind her, several other drivers from Atlas Freight were already there, men and women who had been stranded during the system collapse. They looked uncertain but hopeful. "You're telling me we just switch companies?" Mike asked. "It's not a switch," Sarah said. "It's survival." Emily, watching the incoming data streams, saw something she had not seen in months. Flow returning. Not perfect, not complete, but alive. She leaned back slightly in her chair. Victor noticed. "You approve?" "I don't approve," she said, "but it's working." That was the closest thing Emily Carter ever gave to approval. By evening, Sarah made her decision. She signed the transition agreement with Nova Logistics and placed her Atlas credentials on the table beside it. "I'm done watching systems die from the inside," she said. Mike signed next, slower but certain. "If this keeps me moving," he muttered, "I'm in." That night, Emily stood alone on the loft balcony overlooking Chicago's river lights. Her phone buzzed once, an unknown number from Atlas Domain still trying to reach her. She ignored it. Below her, Nova Core continued to grow, quietly absorbing routes, drivers, and trust that Atlas had lost. Emily exhaled slowly. For the first time since everything began, she was not fixing a broken system. She was building a new one. Atlas Freight no longer looked like a collapsing system. It looked like a patient on life support, machines still running, but nothing truly functioning on its own. Inside the headquarters, the air was heavy with recycled tension. Ryan Blake stood in the executive control room, staring at the financial cascade report unfolding across the wall screen. At 33, Ryan was still young for a CEO. Clean-cut, sharp jawline, perfectly tailored suit, but the confidence that once defined him now flickered like a weak signal. Beside him, Daniel Brooks looked exhausted beyond recognition. His usual analytical calm had fractured. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, glasses slightly crooked, and his hands trembled faintly as he scrolled through error logs. "We're losing liquidity faster than we can patch it," Daniel said quietly. "If the next shipment cycle fails, we default on 3 major contracts." Chloe Mercer stood near the window, arms crossed. Her normally controlled expression was tighter now, her voice sharper. "We don't have cycles anymore. We have failures repeating themselves." Ryan didn't respond immediately. For the first time, he didn't have a prepared answer. Outside the building, a critical incident was unfolding in real time. A high-priority pharmaceutical shipment, bound for hospitals across 3 states, had been stuck in transit for over 18 hours. Temperature control systems were failing. Insurance thresholds were being exceeded minute by minute. If the cargo spoiled, Atlas would not just lose money, it would face legal collapse. At a temporary Nova Logistics hub in St. Louis, Sarah Nguyen watched the same incident from a different dashboard. Unlike Atlas's rigid system, Nova's interface was fluid, adaptive. She adjusted her posture slightly as she analysed the flow. Mike Dawson stood nearby, arms folded, watching her work. "You're watching them fail," Mike said. "I'm watching a pattern repeat," Sarah corrected. "Bad architecture always breaks the same way." Mike frowned. "That sounds cold." "It's not cold," she replied. "It's accurate." A new figure entered the hub, Laura Bennett, Nova's field operations director. She was in her late 30s, tall, athletic build, with short blonde hair and a no-nonsense expression. Her presence carried authority without needing volume. "We can absorb part of Atlas's diverted freight," Laura said, "but only if they stop bleeding clients first." Sarah looked up. "They won't stop unless leadership changes." Laura raised an eyebrow. "You're suggesting a takeover?" "I'm suggesting a rescue," Sarah corrected. Back at Atlas, Ryan finally made a decision, but it came too late in the cycle. "We need to bring Emily Carter back into the system," he said suddenly. Daniel froze. "That's not possible. She's fully integrated with Nova now." Chloe turned sharply. "You're seriously considering reaching out to her after everything?" Ryan didn't answer immediately. His gaze stayed fixed on the screen showing cascading red alerts. "I built this system thinking intelligence could replace experience," he said quietly. "I was wrong." The silence in the room deepened. Another alert triggered. The pharmaceutical shipment had crossed the critical failure threshold. At the same time, Sarah received a secure transmission from Atlas Legal Counsel. The message was simple. Emergency negotiation requested. Full leadership review on table. Immediate operational assistance needed. She forwarded it directly to Emily. Emily read it without changing expression. Victor Hale, standing beside her in the loft, leaned forward slightly. "They're collapsing faster than expected." "They over-optimized," Emily replied. Victor smiled faintly. "So, do we help them?" Emily paused for a long moment. "I don't help systems that refuse to change," she said. "But I do help people inside them." Mike watched Sarah carefully. "You're going back there?" he asked. Sarah nodded slowly. "Only if they accept conditions." Laura stepped in. "What kind of conditions?" Sarah looked at both of them. "New leadership structure, no single-point control, and Emily Carter's operational framework gets adopted, fully." Mike let out a short laugh. "You're basically rewriting the company." "No," Sarah said calmly. "I'm preventing it from dying." Back at Atlas, Ryan stood alone after the meeting ended. The control room had emptied, leaving only the glow of failing dashboards. For the first time, he understood something fundamental. He was not losing control of the company. He had never truly had it. His phone buzzed, a message from legal. Conditions proposed by Nova Logistics accepted for emergency stabilization discussion. Ryan closed his eyes. "Then bring her in," he said softly. And far away, in the quiet loft above Chicago's river, Emily finally stood up from her desk. Victor noticed immediately. "Decision?" She nodded once. "I'll go," she said. Not to save Atlas, but to decide what part of it deserved to survive. The negotiation room inside Atlas Freight headquarters was no longer a place of authority. It had become a place of reckoning. Ryan Blake stood at the center of it, no longer looking like a CEO. At 33, he still carried the sharp suit and polished appearance, but his posture had shifted, shoulders slightly lowered, expression stripped of defensive confidence. For the first time since taking office, he looked human rather than executive. Across the table sat Emily Carter. Emily, 42, remained composed as ever, tall, lean, hair tied back in a precise knot. Her presence calm, but commanding in a different way than corporate leadership. She wasn't imposing through authority, she was imposing through clarity. Victor Hale from Nova Logistics sat beside her, arms folded, observing quietly. Sarah Nguyen stood slightly behind, no longer an employee of Atlas, but not entirely outside its fate either. Mike Dawson had been invited as a driver representative, his weathered face tense but hopeful. And for the first time in weeks, Atlas Freight felt still. Emily placed a revised operational blueprint on the table. "This is not an acquisition," she said evenly. "And it's not a takeover." Ryan studied the document. "Then what is it?" "A reconstruction," Emily replied. Daniel Brooks, standing near the glass wall, exhaled slowly as he scanned the diagrams. His exhaustion had not disappeared, but something in his expression softened, like a man finally seeing order after prolonged chaos. Chloe Mercer, arms crossed tightly, broke the silence. "And what happens to leadership?" Emily didn't look at her immediately. "Leadership stops being centralized." That sentence landed heavier than any financial projection. Mike shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He was still wearing his worn jacket, hands rough from years on the road. "So what does this mean for drivers like us?" Sarah answered before Emily could. "It means stability," she said. Contracts that don't vanish when one person makes a mistake. Payments that don't depend on a single access point. Mike nodded slowly. So we stop being collateral damage? Exactly, Sarah replied. Ryan leaned back slightly, rubbing his temples. I built this system to be efficient. Emily looked at him directly. You built it to be dependent on control. That's not efficiency. That's fragility. Silence followed. Even Victor didn't interrupt. Outside the room, legal teams finalized the transition framework. Atlas Freight would not be absorbed. It would be restructured into a hybrid system. Nova's decentralized architecture layered over Atlas's existing infrastructure. But leadership would change. That condition was non-negotiable. Ryan finally spoke again, quieter this time. If I agree to this, I'm stepping down. Emily nodded once. Yes. He looked at the table, then at the people around him, engineers, drivers, analysts, all waiting for something stable to emerge from the wreckage. I thought I was modernizing the company, he said, but I was just speeding up its collapse. No one interrupted him. For the first time, he wasn't being judged. He was being understood. Mike let out a slow breath. So what happens now? Sarah answered again, this time with certainty. Now it works. 2 weeks later, the transformation was already visible. Trucks moved again, this time under adaptive routing instead of rigid commands. Payment systems stabilized. The stranded pharmaceutical shipment was finally delivered with controlled loss mitigation rather than total failure. Daniel, now part of the new hybrid engineering group, stared at the live dashboard. It's actually self-correcting. Chloe, standing beside him, said nothing for once. Her usual skepticism had softened into reluctant acknowledgement. Ryan Blake officially resigned that morning. There was no press conference, no dramatic exit, just a signed document and a quiet acknowledgement that his vision had reached its limit. Before leaving, he met Emily one last time. You were right, he said simply. Emily replied without emotion. Not right, just earlier. That distinction mattered to her more than agreement ever would. Outside the building, Mike stood with Sarah as trucks rolled past on newly stabilized routes. So this is it? Mike asked. Sarah nodded. This is the start. Mike smiled faintly. Feels strange. Like we survived something we didn't fully understand. We did, Sarah said. At Nova headquarters, Victor reviewed the final integration report. Emily stood by the window, looking out over Chicago. You didn't destroy Atlas, Victor said. I never intended to, Emily replied. I removed its failure points. Victor smirked slightly. That's one way to say it. Emily didn't respond, because for her, it wasn't about destruction or victory. It was about continuity. And in the rebuilt system, neither Atlas nor Nova, but something between them, trucks kept moving. Not perfectly, but sustainably. The story ends, but the choice is yours. Would you be Ryan, stepping down to save the system, or fighting to keep control at any cost? Would you be Emily, rebuilding what broke you, or walking away forever? Would you trust a new system built by the same people who failed you once before? Comment your choice below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful stories like this.